In this video, we will be learning about fasteners, specifically buttons, and how to sew those on. I have before me everything that I need to sew on a button, including my fabric. So first, let's take a look at these buttons. There are a few different types of buttons. Buttons can come in all kinds of shapes, sizes, and different types. So these two right here are called 4-hole buttons, because they have 4 holes. It's as simple as that. These are 2-hole buttons. There's really no difference in strength between these two, not usually. They're just decorative. One is a little easier to sew than the other, possibly just because there's less holes to go through, but these are equal strength. And they're basically the same, but they are the most common type of button you'll find that are standard buttons. You can actually find buttons that have more holes than this, but it's kind of rare. 4 and 2 are the standard that most buttons come in. Then there's a third type of button, and these are the ones that have a flat head like this, but on the back side, there is a hole. These are called shank buttons because this part right here is a shank. So the way this button attaches on, it attaches this way, but the way you sew it on is slightly different from these hole buttons because you can't see the hole from the right side of the garment. So we're going to begin with the 2-hole button. Again, they come in many shapes and sizes. Some have printed patterns on them. You may find 2-hole buttons that aren't even circles, and that's totally normal as well. It's the number of holes that keeps it attached to the garment. So I'm going to scoot these to a side. And I'm going to use this larger button so that we can see our work a little better. So I have before me my fabric sample. So I just folded it in half and pressed it because most often you're going to be sewing through more than one layer of fabric when attaching things together in hand sewing, particularly with a button. Now, buttons can be put on to garments under a machine, but they require a special foot, a button foot. So usually for speed, ease, and just generally, it's a lot easier to be accurate and it's a lot stronger. Buttons are sewn on by hand because everything about them tends to be a lot faster and easier than doing it by machine. Now, when we were doing our seam stitches and different types of hand sewing, we were using what was called a single thread. But when you're doing fasteners, you want to use more than one thread. At minimum, you want to use at least 2 threads. So what do I mean by that? So in my needle is only 1 thread, but it is twice as long as I would usually cut my thread. When I cut my thread to hand sew, I usually do 1 arm's length because that's a pretty good size to work with without it being too short to sew very far and not so long that it tangles on itself. So what I did with this is I already cut it out and I cut it 2 arm's lengths. I threaded my needle and I pulled both ends together here so that they are the same length, roughly. They don't have to be the exact length. But when you're sewing with a single thread, you would just put 1 knot in one of these. But when we're sewing with double thread or more than 2 threads, you want to tie a knot in all of the threads at the end. So I'm just going to tie a knot like normal, but I crossed both of my threads over the needle to do my knot tying. So now this is knotted. If I were to kind of open this up, I can't. We've created a loop here through, which is actually really great. I love sewing with double threads because if you let go of your needle, it's not going to come unthreaded because there's nowhere for the needle to exit the thread. So I'm going to use a double thread. You can, for fasteners, to make things go faster and to create stronger stitches, you can thread 2 threads through the eye of your needle, make them all the same length at the end, and tie a knot. That would actually give you 4 threads that you're tying a knot into. So every stitch you take is the equivalent of 4 stitches for every 1 stitch. Okay, so when we're doing buttons, sometimes you do have to start from the side where your button exists, but more often than not, you're actually going to be starting from the opposite side. When you're working on a garment, you would have a specific dot or X or some form of marking to tell you exactly where this button goes. When sewing on buttons, you would also need to do buttonholes. When we talk about machine sewing, we'll cover how to do machine buttonholes, because machine buttonholes are a lot stronger. It's very rare that there would be a need to do a hand buttonhole. So we're gonna do machine ones, but we'll cover that later. But when you're doing a garment, you wanna construct the buttonhole first and then attach the button so that the button falls exactly where it needs to in relation to the buttonhole, because the buttonhole you're actually cutting through the fabric, so you need to make sure that that is correct. So I'm gonna move my button out of the way. For your sample, you can start anywhere on your fabric. We're gonna put all 3 button types on one sample. So I'm gonna start this one at the end, and I'm just pushing my needle through the fabric. So my knot is on one side, and my thread is coming out of the other. Now I just thread the button on, just like that. And then I'm gonna go back through the hole. And normally I would do this all in one step, but I'm doing this in more than one step so that you can see exactly where I'm placing my needle and whatnot. So this is where I came out. This is where I want to go back in, because that's roughly how far apart these holes are. And now I'm going to pull this into place. But before I pull this tightly, one thing I want to do is you can hand sew buttons on and just make it nice and tight. But often a button is going to be a lot stronger, sturdier, and will function better if you do a shanking method with it. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So all you need is a pin. You can use an awl. You just need some form of long, flat spacer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my needle, pin, right here between where my thread is going in and out of the fabric. And I discovered the last time I was doing buttons, hey, I'm using this pin. Why don't I actually pin it to the fabric so it stays in place and I don't have to hold it at the same time? Because as you get started, you will eventually stitch over it enough that the spacer is held in place by the tension of your stitches. But when you get started, it's kind of hard to do that. So the pin is actually held in the fabric below where my needle is for the spacer. Excuse me, pin. I'm gonna keep trying to call that a needle. So just pull my thread, and it's really easy. So you can't do the running stitch method with this. You can't do the scoop. You're gonna have to go up and down. And the hardest part about sewing on buttons is trying to figure out where your hole is. So I'm actually gonna look at the back side, get a rough idea of where my hole is, because that's where my knot is. So you'll come up through your hole. Whoop. Don't pull too hard or fast, because then your thread might knot on itself. Come on, fabric. There we go. Oh, I know what happened. I sewed right through the knot, and I actually I managed to hit my knot exactly. And I was trying to come down with it. There we go. Okay. So you come up through one hole and go down through the other. And all the while, you are keeping whatever you're using as a spacer between your button and where you're stitching. You can also, if you really want to, I find this a little bit more tricky to hold, you can put your spacer on top of your button as long as you're sewing over it. And that's all you do. So you're gonna go up and down several times. At least 4 stitches is what I would recommend. The more stitches you do, the stronger it is. So that's 3 stitches. And here's my 4th. So this is where I'm gonna call this button good. So I've done 4 stitches, but since I'm sewing with a double thread, it's actually 8 rows of thread. So it's almost like 8 stitches. So now to continue the shanking method, what I want to do next is I want to come up under my button, but I don't want to go through the hole. I want to come out where I was coming out before to go up through the hole, just don't actually go through the hole. I'm going to come out the side here, remove my spacer, And now I want to wrap this thread around the button. 2, 3, 4, 5-ish times. I'm going to kind of hold that in place and go back down underneath. I'm actually going to go through to the opposite side and pull that thread. And then I will tie my knot on this side. So what this does is it creates a little thread shank. So what that does is it gives it a tiny bit of space between your fabric sample and your button. So when your buttonhole, the fabric with your buttonhole in it sits between these two layers, there's a little bit more space there for it to fit smoothly underneath. So now what I'm gonna do, just gonna tie this off. In my usual method, use any kind of knot you want. You don't have to use the kind that I'm using. This is just the one that functions the best for me. Boop. And because it always bothers me to have lots of tails, I'm going to trim my tails down, making sure that I'm not accidentally cutting off my knot. And that's it. That is how you do a 2-hole button. Okay, so we're going to repeat that process, but with the 4-hole button. I have enough thread here that I can manage to get another button on. So I'm going to tie my knot just like usual. Do the exact same thing. Use this red one. Okay, now the difference between a 4-hole button and a 2-hole button is that 2 holes, there's only 2 to go through. You can only go across one ways. But 4-hole buttons, you can do all kinds of really cool stuff. So I've got a little scrap of paper here, and each of these 4 dots kind of represents a 4-hole button. So you can do kind of like what we did with the 2-hole. You can just go back and forth between 2, and then back and forth between 2. Or you can make a little X by going back and forth between 2, but at a diagonal. You can also do some really fancy stuff like I've seen before. I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you just are going to have buttons that are decoration and not strength. But you can totally do fun decorative stuff like do a diagonal and then do side by side. And you've got this little, whatever you see, arrow. Sometimes I see a little like the bottom of a flower, but without the flower head. You can do all kinds of really cool stuff like that. You could even do, a box if you wanted to. All of those things are different ways that you could do a 4-hole button. I'm going to do the X just because it's nice and classic, and I personally prefer the X on a 4-buttonhole. I think it looks prettier, and I've never tested to see if it actually is stronger, but in my mind, I feel like it is stronger. But I've not tested that. That's just personal preference. So I'm going to do the same thing like I did before. I'm just going to start on the back side, pull my needle through. Again, on a regular garment, I would have a marking for where this falls. Pick up my button. I'm going to thread it through. And since I'm doing an X, I want a diagonal. I'm going to go back down at a diagonal. Now you can totally, I actually think this is probably the better way to do it. And this is how I usually do it. I actually put my button exactly where I want it, then put my needle through. Just like that. I'm going to move my button out of the way. So I'm going to pull this slowly so my thread doesn't twist on itself. It's one of the challenges with buttons when you're starting them is to keep your thread from getting twisted. I'm going to do the same shanking method that I did before. So I'm going to punch that into the fabric below where my button's going to go so that it's sitting flat between the fabric and the button. So you can, when you're doing a crisscross, you can go back and forth like this. So I'm coming up out of the bottom right hole, going in the top left hole, which is going to make an X for me. Or you can just go round and round in the same spot. So I'm going to go round and round the same spot about 3 times. Because again, you want at least 3 stitches between those holes, three or more. I tend to play it safe and do 4 is my minimum. So that was 2. This is 3. Since this is a 4-hole, I'm doing more stitches. I'll just stop at 3. And then I'm going to do the opposite direction. So it already has one, so this is stitch number 2, stitch number 3, go down. Now I'm going to do the same thing I did on my 2-hole button. I'm going to come up underneath my button, accidentally hit the hole, and come out the side so I'm not actually coming up through a hole. I'm going to remove my spacer and wrap my thread around. I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The more you wrap, the thicker your shank will be, but also the height of your shank is very dependent on the height of the spacer that you use. So for example, this is a pretty thin pin, so my space that I'm creating with my shank is not very tall. Whereas if I were to use something larger, like say an awl, or I don't know, even a crochet hook point, not a crochet hook point, a knitting needle point, that would be a significant difference in that spacing. And you would choose your spacer size based on your garment. So if you're doing like a coat where the other layer with the buttonhole that has to sit between the fabric and the button is a lot taller, you're going to want to make a larger thread shank. Or even better, use a button with a shank that has a decent height on it as well. Okay, so I wrap my thread around the button to create a thread shank. And now I am tying this off. Just like normal. I'm going to trim my thread. Okay, so the amount of thread I have here is not enough to do another button, so I need to get some more thread. Give me just a moment. All right, now I have more thread and I am ready to go. So now we're going to look at shank buttons. So I'm actually, let's see. I think I'm going to use this one because you guys can see the shank a little better. But I do want to point out really quick, so the heads of shanks can be vastly different sizes, as well as the thickness of the shanks. I'm going to use this gold one because I think you guys can see it better. A shank button is not really something you should be scared of. It is just different. But like all buttons, you're going to have a spot on your garment where your button should go, and you're going to come up at that spot. Now, since this button has a shank to it, we don't have to do any kind of spacer at all because it's built into the button. So I'm just going to go through this hole, pull it through, and go back down into my fabric. Come out the back side. Very slowly pull this because I do not want this thread to get twisted. See how it's kind of twisting like that? I don't want it twisted for this first stitch because I want this shank to sit flat against the fabric. Okay, so I pulled it through, and now you can kind of see how it's being held onto the fabric. So I don't have a hole to find, but I do need to bring my needle back up right beside my shank. I'm going to turn this sideways so you guys can kind of see how I'm coming up and out. So I come out, and you can kind of come out and go through the hole in the same step. I don't usually do that because then I feel like my stitches are too wide across my shank button. So I come up around the side, go through the hole, and back down right beside. Get all these threads out of the way. And pull through. So I'm creating this kind of loop around the shank. So that's how our stitches worked. And that's actually what these did as well, but it just seems like it comes out a little different. Kind of pull this. You do want to make sure that you are pulling your stitches tight enough that your shank sits against the edge of your fabric. So I've done 2 stitches. I want to do at least 4 or more, unless you're doing a 4-hole. And then you're gonna do the same thing. It'll just come out with more stitches. So that was This will be stitch number 3. And the more stitches you do, the stronger your button is. So if you have a button that's in a place on a garment that you know is going to take a lot of stress, particularly in like musical theater, garments tend to take a lot of stress in musical theater because there's lots of dancing and movement and all kinds of crazy business going on. So you want to make sure everything is very thoroughly secured. You can overstitch a button, but you're very unlikely to overstitch a button if you try to overshoot. My thread's getting wrapped around my shank. Hold up. There we go. All right, I'm getting some tangling going on here. So anytime you have a tangle while you're hand sewing, just gently pull your your thread away from your fabric. And just kind of gently work at the thread because you don't want to pull hard because then you might actually make a knot in it. So it looks like there's a knot forming there, but it wasn't. It was just twisted up on itself. But because I pulled gently, I did not create a knot there. If I had pulled really hard, I would have created a knot there. I'm going to come up one more time and go through one more time. And since it's a shank button, we don't have to do the thread shanking like we did on the others. We just get to pull it through, oh goodness, and knot it off on the back side. So that's what I'm going to do. Sorry, I keep accidentally pulling this out of frame. That is not intentional. All right, tie a knot. I've got some extra longer threads here because I didn't pull one of my stitches all the way through tightly. So that was a mistake on my part. But I just did enough stitches that one won't matter. So I tie it off. Boom, boom, boom. Clip my threads. And I have these loops here. They are part of a stitch, so I don't want to trim these down. If they bothered me significantly, or if I knew that these stitches would be seen from the right side of the garment, I would completely redo this button. I would take my seam ripper, cut my threads, and redo my button so that it looks prettier. So there we go. There are the 3 main types of buttons and how to sew them on.